Tony Ferguson versus Khabib Nurmagomedov. What would have happened if this fight actually occurred, and was it the most cursed fight in history? A couple months ago, a viewer left a comment asking me to do an analysis of this fight and what would have happened. And I think if you think about this fight, just, in recent terms and seeing where Tony Ferguson's career ended up versus where Khabib's ended up undefeated, it would be easy to draw the conclusion that, well, Tony would have gotten smoked and, Khabib would have dominated the fight, and that's that. And while I don't disagree with that, as you'll see as I go on in this video, I think it's important to look at some of the fights of the past and some of the attributes of each fighter and how their styles matched up around the time that they were first matched up, all the way up until the most recent cancellation, and not just looking at, Tony's most recent performances where, he's looked, probably his worst that he has in his career. Obviously, he's been on a downward trajectory. He looked decent in the Chandler fight until things went bad, but generally he's just been getting out grappled really bad in fights, and the fight against Nate was not a good look either. So the main thing I wanted to focus on here is just some of the key points between their styles, both strengths and weaknesses, and how I would have seen this fight going if it had ever happened. So first off, both of these fighters had really good conditioning. Tony was known for that, incredible cardio. He went 5 rounds with RDA in one of his best performances at altitude in Mexico City, and his conditioning was just second to none. Tony was not the fighter that was ever going to gas out in any fight, and Khabib's conditioning was equally amazing with the pace that he would set on guys. Both fighters were also very athletic. I think Khabib's speed was one of his things that was underrated in his career too. You don't typically think of Khabib as a super explosive fast fighter, but if you really go back and watch his fights, he was really fast. He had really quick hands, and he could just explode into takedowns and chain things together at a very high rate. Tony also, was a very unorthodox fighter and would do crazy things, from crazy angles and spins and Imanari rolls and all these things. So in terms of athleticism, I think that both of these fighters were really comparable, but I would give Khabib the strength and power advantage overall. So moving on to the grappling, this is where a lot of the conversation and theory and analysis of this fight was happening. People wondered, would Khabib just dominate Tony in the grappling, or would Tony be able to use his guard, the 10th planet jiu-jitsu, the elbows from the guard, his unorthodox style, and be able to stop the grappling of Khabib? And even I used to think about this too, that, Tony's submission threat off his back would be a big problem for Khabib that he hadn't faced with other fighters, and that Tony's elbows were just, razor sharp and could open up a cut that would make things slippery, and Khabib wouldn't be able to control the fight like he was used to doing. But now looking back on it, and not just the hindsight of recent fights, but really looking at some of his fights of the past and his statistics, I think that Tony would have had a glaring weakness in the grappling. The first major thing to address here is the idea of Tony's guard being a huge threat. If you actually watch Tony's fights, he was more of an opportunistic submission hunter. He wasn't really a guy that was hitting submissions off his back, and he was usually stunning guys or hurting them with a barrage of strikes, or throwing a lot of different things at them and catching submissions in a scramble from the front headlock, throwing the his patented Darce choke from there. But he wasn't really the guy that was going to be taken down and and hit an armbar off his back, or a triangle, or sweep and get on top and do all this stuff. He was more of a scramble heavy fighter who would damage opponents and lock up submissions in transition after landing a lot of that damage, or catching them in the midst of scrambling scenarios. However, because of his opportunistic style, he was also a fighter that would leave himself open a lot in the grappling and would often give up takedowns while going for submission while trying to defend takedowns. We saw this early on in his UFC career, and he would often give up bad positions while going for submissions. So he would present a high threat with the submission, but if he didn't get it, it would often get his guard passed or get him held down for the entirety of a round, and he would give up rounds and positions that he really shouldn't have. Tony's takedown defense in general just wasn't the greatest, and if you look at his statistics leading up to the Kevin Lee fight in 2016, Tony had landed 6 takedowns himself, but he had been taken down 10 times. He also had a tendency to throw kicks that would sometimes get caught and lead to takedowns, and even Edson Barboza had landed a takedown on him this way in their fight. Going back to Tony's guard, his guard was largely overrated if you really review his fights and the statistics. In 21 fights, he only had 1 submission from guard, which was on Kevin Lee, who was absolutely exhausted at that point. And not to take anything away from that submission, it was a great submission, a great triangle, but if you go back and watch the fight, Kevin Lee was clearly just completely gassed, and it looked like he was just stuck in quicksand on the ground until Tony just threw up that triangle and caught him. He really wasn't doing a lot to improve his position or defend the triangle. And it wasn't necessarily some lightning fast triangle attempt by Tony either. You could see it coming, but Kevin Lee just wasn't able to defend it at that point due to exhaustion. So overall with Tony's grappling, he presented a good submission threat, but if he would miss those, he would often give up dominant positions. And against a fighter like Khabib, obviously, that is the polar opposite of what you want to do. Also, his takedown defense wasn't the greatest, and despite Tony bragging about his wrestling, he wasn't able to defend a lot of shots from fighters, and he was definitely vulnerable to takedowns. His tendency to throw a lot of different strikes and attacks out there, including kicks, would potentially get him caught and also taken down. And lastly, his guard simply wasn't the threat that some people think it was. Now on Khabib's side of the grappling, what is there to say? We've seen it. He chains relentless takedowns together, single legs, double legs, body locks, trips from the clinch. He just has an arsenal of takedowns that he can keep chaining together, and his pace is relentless. Now, if you contrast that with the weaknesses of Tony's grappling game, I think it's just a nightmare matchup for Tony, especially with his propensity to give up body locks, which we saw in more of his recent fights, but you could also see it in some of his older fights too. That's how Kevin Lee took him down. And during that fight, early on in round 1, when he did get the body lock takedown, he was able to pass Tony's guard without much trouble and achieve the mount and start landing ground and pound. And the only reason that he lost the mount in that fight is that he got a little bit lazy with the control. He gave Tony some space and allowed Tony to shrimp out and escape that, but he continued to throw ground and pound from the top. Tony didn't get up from that, and the only thing that really saved Tony there from eating more shots on the ground was the end of the round. So thinking about this fight, I'm like, if Kevin Lee can lock up a body lock, take him down, pass, and gets him out, why wouldn't Khabib? Kevin Lee is a really good grappler, and I think he was really underrated in that sense. He controlled some really good guys on the ground, including Charles Oliveira, but Khabib is just the elite of the elite in terms of pressure and grappling in the cage, as we saw. Never beaten, taking people down over and over again, and always dragged people into his game. And I wouldn't see this fight any different had it happened. Now, moving on to the striking, one of the angles that was discussed in the past was that Tony's unorthodox striking, high volume style, and elbows would have given Khabib trouble and potentially damaged him a lot and thrown off his grappling game. Now, while anything could happen in MMA, I just don't think that would have played out against Khabib that way. The core of Tony's striking style really revolved around him accumulating damage over time with a high volume of strikes. He had a good jab, he had good hooks, he had good uppercuts, elbows, knees, leg kicks, he would switch stances. He was really good at throwing a barrage of different strikes at an opponent and accumulating damage over time. But he wasn't a fighter with a concussive punch necessarily. He wouldn't really put guys out with one shot. And that's one of the ways that people used to think about how Khabib could possibly lose in his fights. If he ate one big shot and got knocked out coming in, for a takedown, that might be the thing that beats Khabib. But Tony wasn't the guy with that huge power. If you go back and look at Tony Ferguson's KO or TKO wins, he actually only has 2 fights that were ended with one punch. The first one was in the Ultimate Fighter finale where he won by KO, and the second one was versus Kukuno, who is a very unorthodox fighter in general and took a lot of damage before Tony landed that KO shot. He might have even been out on his feet before he landed the punch, and he just sustained a lot of damage. So you can count it. It definitely ended with one punch, but there was a lot of damage sustained before that. And those 2 fights are the fights that I would consider ending due to concussive power. They ended with one big punch that just put the fighter out. And his other fights were typically TKO wins due to accumulated damage. Like the Donald Cerrone fight was stopped due to damage to Cerrone's eye and the swelling, and he couldn't see. And the Anthony Pettis fight ended because Pettis felt that he broke his hand. And if you go further back than that, if you look at a fight like the Aaron Riley fight, that fight ended because Riley broke his jaw and it was a TKO win. He never actually got knocked down and the ref stopped the fight. So all in all, Tony was a fighter that was going to throw a lot of different attacks on the feet and accumulate damage in terms of volume over time. In his fights against Cerrone, Pettis, and RDA, he landed over 100 significant strikes. And even against Gaethje, a fight that he lost, he landed over 100 in that fight as well. So while Tony could inflict damage or hurt or stun a fighter with one shot, he was more so the type that was going to inflict damage over time rather than one big concussive shot. Now, the glaring problem with this style against somebody like Khabib is that it was very, very hard, if not impossible, to gain any momentum over time against Khabib. Volume-heavy strikers like the Diaz brothers or Max Holloway, they ramp up over time, and you need to land a lot of strikes to accumulate that damage, obviously with a heavy volume style. But due to Khabib's high pace, pressure, aggressiveness, and takedown game, a high volume striker would be at an immediate disadvantage against him because it was so hard to get that momentum built up. You can really see 2 examples of this when Khabib fought Gaethje and Poirier. Both Gaethje and Poirier are typically fighters that have a high output of significant strikes per minute, but they weren't able to get that going against Khabib at all. And even in the moments where Khabib did start to get tagged by them, he would often circle out and be able to recover, throw his own jab, and just to break up any of that momentum that they were building. He wasn't a guy that would sit there in firefights and accumulate damage. He would often reset and not allow an fighter to gain momentum against him. And of course, from there, Khabib would throw in takedowns, which would really destroy any attempts at building an offense against him. And Khabib was never a fighter that would accept fighting off the back foot very long before mounting his own pressure back. You know, he would fire back aggressively. He was an aggressive fighter almost all the time. You know, he would circle out a little bit and he'd come right back and get right back in your face with jabs, hooks, knees, anything to back you up towards the fence to immediately start threatening that takedown again or to land his own strike. And he had deceptive speed, like I said. When he fought Conor, you know, the big question in everyone's mind was, can Conor land the big left hand? But, you know, who ended up landing the knockdown instead? Khabib. So while Tony had a diverse striking skill set and was very dangerous on the feet and would typically damage opponents, you know, we've seen the memes with all the bloody faces of all Tony's opponents. I don't think that would have worked here against Khabib. I don't think he would have been able to build enough of an offense without having to deal with takedowns or being backed up by strikes himself. And if he did start to mount an offense against Khabib, I think Khabib would have been very good at circling out, breaking up that momentum and damage, and getting the fight back into a situation of where he wanted it to go and where he wanted to be, with him as the aggressor and pushing Tony on the back foot. So all in all, without making this video an hour-long analysis of these two fighters, I think that Tony's weaknesses played perfectly into Khabib's strengths. Tony had a really diverse, exciting style that was a lot of fun to watch. He's one of my favorite fighters to watch in history, and in his prime, he was awesome, and I think he was an elite lightweight. But when it came to Khabib, I think it was a really, really bad style matchup for him. The same things that made Tony great were also the same things that would give Khabib an opportunity to take over the fight and control him. Tony's tendency to be an opportunistic submission hunter just wouldn't have matched up well with somebody like Khabib, who has great submission defense and is a submission hunter himself and just an absolutely smothering wrestler, as we know. And he has so many ways to enter the takedown, whether it's through body locks, single legs, double legs, trips, all those things. So I think it would have been too difficult for Tony to avoid a takedown while being himself completely, while being the diverse striker and the grappler that he was. At some point he would have gotten caught, and we saw somebody like Kevin Lee expose some of those holes early on in the fight with him and get him in a bad position quickly. And in the striking, I think Khabib would have been surprisingly tough to a lot of people as well. We typically think about him as a grappler, but he's very fast and he hits hard and he has a good jab and he knows when to circle out when things aren't going his way in order to regain his composure and apply pressure. So it really sucks that we never got to see this fight, because it would have been an amazing clash of two fighters, but I think overall Khabib would have got it and probably landed a TKO or even a submission in the fight. I think Khabib probably would have gone for a submission, honestly, because I think Khabib really wanted to prove a point with this fight. You know, Tony used to talk about how he was going to out-grapple Khabib, out-wrestle him, submit him, all these things, and Khabib was the type that really wanted to assert his dominance. Khabib was just one of those fighters in the cage that had a certain ferocity and aggressiveness to him that you could just feel when you watch him fight. When he was grounding and pounding, you could just tell he just wanted to punch the guy through the floor, you know. And when he was grappling and just smothering guys, he was doing it in a way where he was really asserting his dominance, and he wanted that guy to feel how dominant he was. You know, you saw him talking to Michael Johnson during the fight, and even after the first round with Dustin Poirier, when Poirier goes to stand up, Khabib stares him down as he walks away, you know, as a way to say, hey, I'm in control of this fight. So anyway, that concludes this one. Let me know your thoughts and comments down below and how you would have seen this fight going, and I'll see you in the next one.